everyone, Suzanne here. I hope you're all well and welcome to So Custom. Today's video is going to be the making of this little number. So if you're interested in seeing that, then let's get started.
So starting with the fabric, I'm using this cotton fabric. I talk about it a little bit more in my plans video. And onto the layout. So this fabric is striped, so I want the stripes to run up the body on the bodice pieces and across the body on the yoke pieces. So I'm just arranged my layout to accommodate that. I've also given myself a bit of a placket there on the back yoke, so the piece I'm pointing to now. So I have a 1 centimeter for my button, a 1 centimeter for my interfacing, and a 1 centimeter seam allowance. You can see that here. I'm just snipping notches at the top and bottom of each of those intervals. And then on to the yoke at the front, just one little notch there at the center front. And then the bodice back, just a notch at either side of the hem. And now the last piece, the bodice, the front bodice I should say. So I've snipped a notch at my hem, I've snipped both of my dart legs, popped a pin at the point of the dart, and then one last notch at the center front, and that will help me line the yoke up later. And now on to the marking. So I'm just popping a dot in where the fabric meets the pin that I placed earlier. And now just lining my ruler up with that dot and the notch that I snipped earlier for my dart leg. So that's one marked out. Exactly the same with the second dart leg. And then I've went ahead off camera and done exactly the same thing with the second dart. So now just to pin those darts in place in preparation for sewing. So I'm popping a pin through the leg on top and making sure it comes out through the leg on the bottom, just to make sure both dart legs on top and bottom are lined up the whole way along. So that's that done. So I've done the same on the other side. And now I'm ready to stitch my darts in place. So starting at the legs of the dart, I'm back stitching using a normal stitch length. I'm not back stitching at the end, and I'm just following the lines that I drew earlier. So pulling my threads at the end and then just tying those off. That's that done. And that's how that looks from the inside and the outside. Done. And now I've just pressed those darts towards the hem, keeping everything nice and neat, and moving on to the back. So I've pinned up my center back seam and I'm stitching that at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, back stitching at the start and the end. That's how that looks. So this fabric was quite an expensive fabric. And because I want this top to last quite a long time, I've decided I'm going to do flat fell seams. So to do that, I'm snipping off about 2/3 of the seam allowance on one side, and then on the other side I'm just folding that fabric in underneath so that it completely encloses the snipped edge. So just folding in maybe 3-4 centimeters, or millimeters I should say, and then pressing that all underneath. So you'll see here everything's nicely enclosed, no raw edges at all. And then to finish the flat fell seam, I'm just going to stitch that creased edge in place. So I'm edge stitching here, probably only 1 or 2 millimeters away from the edge. I'm using a little bit of a longer stitch, back stitching at the start and the end. And you can see here, it's super neat. No raw edges whatsoever. I really like this finish. So I do the same thing on all of the seams, but I won't show me doing it on any more throughout this process, but just bear in mind I do the same thing on every seam. So now just placing the yoke on the bodice front, lining up those notches in the center and pinning. And then to stitch, just back stitching at the start and the end, sticking to my 1 centimeter seam allowance the whole way across. And that's how that looks. And then on to the yoke in the back. So you see me snipping the notches at the top and bottom of each of the lines I had drawn for my placket. So I'm just placing a little thin strip of interface in the center of those notches, so just inside the seam allowance. So here I'm pressing that seam allowance in underneath and then pressing the interface piece in underneath as well. So that's my placket all nicely pressed. And now, just to finish the placket off, or to make sure it's secure I should say, I want to stitch along the edge of that crease line. So I'm stitching here with a little bit of a longer stitch length, and I'm trying to stick as close to that edge as I can, so you can see here. So super pleased with that. And now I want to pop some buttonholes in. So to do that, I've measured 1.5 inches down from the neck, and then I've placed a pin, and then at 2-inch intervals I've placed another pin for my 3 buttonholes. I then popped my buttonhole foot on, placed my needle down exactly where the pin was, and just sewing a normal rectangular button. So that's one done. And I go ahead off camera and sew the other 2 in place. So that's those sewn. And again, off camera, I've just opened up those buttonholes, and I'm now placing the placket on top of the lower placket, placing a mark directly through the buttonhole itself, so that I know where to place my buttons underneath. And then I've just stitched those in place, and that's how that looks. And then with the placket all closed up, super neat and tidy. Really love this. So now just to stitch that yoke in place. So in preparation for that, I'm pinning the center of the placket to the center back seam, and then pinning across and stitching at my 1 centimeter seam allowance. I'm going a little bit slow when I get to the placket because I want to make sure that everything remains aligned as I stitch across. And I think I managed to do that, so you can see here the center seam of the back lines up with the center of the placket. So really happy with that. And just showing here that I have flat felled the rest of the seams, so on the yoke front and back. And you'll see later on that I do it on the shoulders and the side seams. So now just to pin those shoulders in place, so I've placed my front bodice over the top of my back bodice, right sides together, and stitching at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, back stitching at the start and the end. And that's how that looks. And I'm ready to pin up my side seams. So stitching here at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, just using a normal straight stitch, back stitching at the start, pivoting at the hem just slightly, and back stitching at the end. And that's how that looks. So pleased with that. And now I want to finish the armholes and the neckline with some bias tape. So I've just made my own here and pressed it. I've pressed up my hem, so I've pressed up my 4 centimeters, and then I've turned the raw edge in underneath by 1 centimeter. And I'm going to edge stitch that on the machine as close to the edge as I can get in a second. But before that, just showing here that I've went ahead and pinned that bias tape to the inside at the armholes and at the neckline in preparation for stitching. And I've just realized a mistake here, but you'll hear more about that in a second. So to the machine to stitch the hem first of all. So as I mentioned, I'm trying to stitch here as close to that creased edge as I can get. I'm using a little bit of a longer stitch length, back stitching at the start and the end. And that's how that looks. So really pleased with that. Nice and neat. And then on to the bias. So this is the armhole, and I'm just stitching at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, back stitching at the start and the end. And then I want to fold that bias tape to the outside. So you'll see here, I'm going to fold it along the crease line, and then I'm going to press the edge in underneath. I'm going to do exactly the same thing on the neckline. So this is the neckline I'm stitching here at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, taking it relatively slowly, making sure I'm maintaining that nice curve of the neckline, folding the bias tape back on itself at the end, just to give a nice neat finish there, you see. And again, it's just a little indication of my mistake. And there you see, I'm just going to fold the bias to the outside, fold the raw edge in underneath and press. So just showing here that my hem's all done and in place. I've went ahead and pressed that bias tape as I indicated earlier. I've trimmed out some of the fabric along the seam line. And now for my mistake. So when I was pinning the bias tape, I realized that when I push the bias tape to the outside, it's going to cover the button and the buttonhole. So I've taken the button off, and now as you look at this, I was thinking, how the heck am I going to fix this? But I'll show you that in a second. So just edge stitching here, this is the armhole, and I'm just edge stitching that bias down to the outside. So just like the hem, I'm trying to get as close to the edge of that seam as I can get, or the crease should I say. And I really love how this has turned out. So that's one armhole done. Of course I do the same on the other. And doing the same thing on the neckline. Going relatively slowly the whole way around. I'm just measuring up there at the edge that my bias tape is folded exactly the same as its corresponding piece on the other side. And that's that done. Love that. So now, to fix my mistake. So what I decided to do here was just sew the button again directly over the top of the buttonhole that I had already sewn, but this time over the top of the bias. And I didn't have high hopes for this, but actually it worked perfectly. So I think it's all getting the alignment right, but it did work really well for me. So I thought I would just show some more close-up views of the inside. So this is the back, and that's the flap fell seamed at the yoke and also at the center back going into the hem. And then the front, same thing again. So I'm just showing here how neat this finish is. So if you have some sort of expensive fabric and you want to make sure that it stays nice for a long time, I think this is a really lovely finish on the inside. And on the outside, so the bias nicely top stitched in place, both around the neck and the armholes. And then the button, so I've sewed on my new button onto the back, and then just how those flat fill seams look from the outside, so super neat. And this is how it looks on. So even though this is a really basic shape and a very basic shift top, I absolutely love this. I love the fit of it, I love the length, I love all of the finishes. A great little wardrobe basic.
So I really hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If you've not yet subscribed, please do. And I shall see you on Friday in my next one. Until then, I hope you have a fantastic week. Bye folks!